She fainted at work, and when doctors revealed her pregnancy, the CEO asked, "Is it my child?" Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She shouldn't have called in sick, but the nausea wouldn't stop. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Pharmaceuticals' 42nd floor, casting long shadows across the polished marble lobby. Amara Collins stood before the elevator, her reflection caught in its gleaming steel doors. Caramel skin glowing despite the exhaustion she couldn't quite shake, her natural curls pulled into a sleek, low bun that framed her elegant neck. At 28, she commanded attention without trying, her tailored navy blazer hugging her curves while maintaining the professional authority she'd worked years to earn. But today, something felt different. "Focus, Amara," she told herself, pressing the button for the executive floor. "You've got the Morrison account presentation in 2 hours." The elevator hummed upward, and with each passing floor, her stomach twisted tighter. She'd blamed it on stress. The endless nights preparing proposals, the pressure of working directly under the most demanding CEO in pharmaceutical history. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, she knew it was something else entirely. Something that started 2 months ago. Something that tasted like champagne and felt like fire. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 38th floor. Amara stepped out, her heels clicking against the pristine white tiles as she made her way toward her corner office, a space she'd earned through sheer brilliance and unwavering dedication. The assistant's desk outside the CEO's office wasn't just any position, it was the gateway to a billion-dollar empire. "Morning, Amara," called Jessica, one of the junior analysts, rushing past with an armload of files. "Ready for the big presentation?" Amara managed to smile, though it felt forced. "Always ready," liar, whispered a voice in her head. "You haven't been ready for anything since Chicago." Chicago, the pharmaceutical conference, the hotel bar, the way he'd looked at her when he thought no one was watching, the way his voice had dropped when he'd asked if she wanted to get some air, the way the city lights had reflected in his steel-grey eyes as he'd kissed her like she was the only woman in the world. The way Damien Hawthorne had made her forget every rule she'd ever made about mixing business with pleasure. Amara shook her head, forcing the memories away as she settled behind her desk. Her computer hummed to life, displaying a calendar packed with meetings, calls, and deadlines. This was her world, controlled, organized, predictable, not the chaos of emotions that threatened to surface every time she thought about that night. The intercom buzzed, startling her from her thoughts. "Ms. Collins, could you bring the Morrison files to my office?" The voice was smooth, commanding, and achingly familiar. Even through the static of the speaker, it sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. Damien Hawthorne, CEO of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, 39 years old, 6'3" of lean muscle and sharp suits, with dark hair that always looked perfectly disheveled and eyes that seemed to see straight through people's souls. He was brilliant, ruthless in business, and had built his empire from nothing after losing his parents in a car accident at 19. He was also the father of the child she didn't yet know she was carrying. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Amara gathered the files, taking a moment to steady herself. She'd perfected the art of professional distance over the past 2 months, treating him exactly as she had before Chicago. Cool, efficient, untouchable. If he could pretend nothing had happened, so could she, even if her body remembered every second of that night. She knocked once on his office door before entering. The space was a study in controlled power, dark wood, leather furniture, and windows that offered a commanding view of Manhattan. Damien stood with his back to her, one hand pressed against the glass as he stared out at the city below. The morning light caught the subtle silver threads in his dark hair, and even in silhouette, she could see the tension in his broad shoulders. "The Morrison files," she said, setting them on his desk with practiced precision. He turned slowly, and for just a moment, a heartbeat, their eyes met. Steel grey clashing with warm brown. The air between them charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle and her breath catch. Then the mask slipped back into place. "Thank you." His voice was neutral, businesslike, as if he hadn't whispered her name like a prayer 2 months ago, as if he hadn't traced every curve of her body like he was memorizing a masterpiece. Amara nodded curtly and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Amara." The way he said her name, soft, almost uncertain, made her pause. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." She stiffened, her hand on the door handle. "I'm fine, Mr. Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne. Not Damien. Never Damien. Not anymore. It's just that you've seemed—" He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she recognized as frustration. "Different, lately. Different. If only he knew how different. If only she knew." "I'm perfectly fine," she repeated, her voice firmer now. "Will that be all?" For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something else, something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way they'd fit together like missing pieces of the same puzzle. But then his jaw tightened and he nodded. "That will be all." Amara escaped to her office, closing the door behind her and leaning against it as she tried to calm her racing heart. This was impossible. She couldn't keep working like this, pretending that the most incredible night of her life hadn't happened, pretending that she didn't dream about his hands on her skin, his lips against her throat, the way he'd made her feel alive in ways she'd never experienced. But she had to. Her career, her future, everything she'd worked for, depended on maintaining the professional boundary they'd shattered in Chicago. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and emails, the nausea coming and going in waves that she stubbornly attributed to stress. By the time the Morrison presentation rolled around, she felt steadier, more in control. This was what she was good at: presenting data, managing expectations, being indispensable. The conference room filled with executives from both companies, the air thick with expensive cologne and the scent of fresh coffee. Amara took her usual position beside Damien's chair, her tablet ready with backup information and additional slides. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damien began, his voice commanding immediate attention, "today, we're not just discussing a merger. We're talking about revolutionizing how the world approaches neurological treatment." As he spoke, Amara felt a familiar swell of pride. Say what you wanted about Damien Hawthorne, the man, but Damien Hawthorne, the CEO, was extraordinary, passionate, visionary, able to make people believe in possibilities they'd never imagined. The presentation was flawless. Data flowed seamlessly, projections painted a picture of unprecedented success, and the Morrison executives nodded with increasing enthusiasm. Amara supplied additional information when needed, their professional partnership as smooth as silk. Then, midway through discussing market penetration in Europe, the room began to tilt. At first, she thought it was just the usual wave of nausea, but this was different, deeper, more insistent. The voices around her became muffled, as if she were underwater. The carefully organized numbers on her tablet blurred together. "Ms. Collins?" someone asked from far away. "Are you all right?" She tried to answer, tried to maintain her composure, but the room spun violently. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Damien's face, twisted with worry and something that looked suspiciously like terror. The last thing she heard was his voice, raw with panic. "Amara!" And in that moment, as consciousness slipped away, she realized her carefully constructed world was about to change forever. The presentation room falls silent. Damien drops to his knees beside her unconscious form. And somewhere in the chaos, a truth neither of them is ready to face begins to surface. The beeping of medical equipment was the first thing she heard when the world came back into focus. Amara's eyelids fluttered open to harsh fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back, the presentation, the spinning room, the darkness swallowing her whole. Thank God. The voice was rough with relief and utterly familiar. She turned her head to find Damien sitting in the chair beside her bed, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened and his steel-grey eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked like he'd aged years in the span of hours. What happened?" Her voice came out as a whisper, her throat dry and scratchy. "I collapsed during the Morrison presentation." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "You've been unconscious for 3 hours. 3 hours, Amara." The way he said her name, raw, vulnerable, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back against the pillows. "The presentation. Did we lose the deal?" Damien stared at her incredulously. "The deal? Amara, you scared the hell out of everyone in that room. I thought—" He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "The deal doesn't matter. Nothing matters except making sure you're okay." The intensity in his voice, the way his mask had completely slipped away, made her chest tighten with emotions she'd been fighting for months. This wasn't her boss speaking. This was the man who'd held her until dawn in Chicago, who'd whispered her name like it was sacred, who'd made her believe in fairy tales for one perfect night. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just stress, probably. I haven't been sleeping well." Before he could respond, the door opened and a woman in a white coat entered, her smile warm and professional. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell, according to her badge, appeared to be in her 40s with kind eyes and greying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Miss Collins, I'm so glad to see you're awake," Dr. Mitchell said, checking the chart in her hands. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Amara admitted. "But I'm okay, just exhausted, I think." Dr. Mitchell's expression grew more serious as she approached the bed. "Actually, I need to discuss your test results with you. We ran some blood work when you came in, just to rule out any underlying conditions that might have caused the fainting episode." Amara felt Damien tense beside her, though she kept her eyes on the doctor. "And? Well, the good news is that there's nothing seriously wrong with you." Dr. Mitchell smiled, but there was something in her expression that made Amara's stomach drop. "In fact, there's some very good news depending on how you look at it." "What do you mean?" Amara's voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Mitchell glanced between her and Damien, clearly assuming he was her husband or boyfriend. "Ms. Collins, you're pregnant. Approximately 8 weeks along, based on your hormone levels." The words hit Amara like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt again, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. 8 weeks. 8 weeks would put the conception right around Chicago. She could feel Damien's eyes boring into her, could practically hear the wheels turning in his head as he did the same math she was doing. 8 weeks ago, she'd been in his hotel room, their bodies moving together in perfect rhythm, lost in a passion that had felt like destiny. 8 weeks. Damien's voice was strained, carefully controlled. Dr. Mitchell nodded cheerfully, oblivious to the tension crackling between them. Yes, which would put conception around mid-March. The fainting episode was likely due to hormonal changes and possibly some morning sickness. It's very common in the first trimester. Amara stared at the ceiling, her mind reeling. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Damien Hawthorne's baby, and she hadn't even known. How could she not have known? The signs had been there, the nausea, the exhaustion, the way her body had felt different lately. But she'd been so focused on maintaining professional distance, on pretending Chicago never happened, that she'd ignored every signal her body had been sending. "I'll give you two some time to process this news," Dr. Mitchell said, apparently mistaking their shocked silence for overwhelmed joy. "I'll be back in a bit to discuss next steps and discharge paperwork. Congratulations." The moment the door closed behind her, the silence in the room became deafening. Amara couldn't look at Damien. She could feel his presence like a physical weight, could hear his breathing change as he processed what they'd just learned. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. 8 weeks. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway, still staring at the ceiling tiles as if they held the answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. "The conference in Chicago was 8 weeks ago." Another nod. Her throat felt too tight to speak. "Amara." His voice was softer now, almost gentle. "Look at me." She couldn't. If she looked at him, if she saw the questions in his eyes, she'd fall apart completely. And Amara Collins didn't fall apart. She was strong, controlled, independent. She didn't get accidentally pregnant by her boss after a one-night stand that was supposed to mean nothing. "Amara, please." The please broke her. She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since the doctor's revelation. What she saw there wasn't anger or accusation. It was raw vulnerability, hope, and something that looked suspiciously like wonder. "Is it mine?" The question came out as barely a whisper, but it might as well have been shouted for the impact it had. The simple question hung between them like a live wire. She could lie. She could tell him she'd been seeing someone else, that there was doubt about paternity. It would be easier that way, cleaner. She could handle this alone, the way she'd handled everything else in her life. But looking into his eyes, seeing the careful hope he was trying to hide, she couldn't do it. "Yes." The word came out broken, barely audible. "Yes, it's yours." The effect was immediate. Damien's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. He leaned back in his chair, running both hands through his hair as he tried to process the magnitude of what she'd just confirmed. When he looked at her again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was rough with emotion. "When you started feeling sick, when you suspected, why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't know." The words exploded out of her, months of suppressed emotions finally breaking free. "I didn't know, Damien. I thought it was stress or exhaustion, or I don't know what I thought, but I didn't think this. She gestured helplessly at her stomach, at the tiny life growing inside her that she'd been completely unaware of until 5 minutes ago. And even if I had known, she continued, her voice shaking, what was I supposed to say? Hey, Mr. Hawthorne, remember that night we pretended never happened? Well, surprise, you're going to be a daddy? Damien flinched at her words, at the pain and sarcasm lacing her voice. We need to talk about that night. No, we don't. Amara turned away again, focusing on the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds. We agreed it was a mistake. We agreed to pretend it never happened. I never agreed to that. His voice was quiet but firm. You decided that. You made that choice for both of us. Because it was the right choice. She whirled back to face him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and hurt. You're my boss, Damien. You're the CEO of the company I work for. What we did was unprofessional and stupid and the most real thing I've felt in years. The words stopped her cold. Damien was standing now, moving closer to her bed with the careful grace of a predator approaching skittish prey. Do you think it was easy for me? He asked, his voice low and intense. Pretending I didn't know how you taste, how you sound when you whisper my name, how perfectly you fit in my arms? Do you think I enjoyed going back to calling you Ms. Collins when all I wanted was to kiss you senseless every time you walked into my office? Amara's breath hitched at his words, at the raw honesty in his voice. This was the Damien she remembered from Chicago. Passionate, vulnerable, utterly human beneath his executive armor. Damien, she whispered, but he wasn't finished. I've been going crazy for 2 months, Amara. Crazy wondering if I imagined how incredible that night was, if I made up the connection between us. And now, he gestured helplessly. Now there's a baby. Our baby. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. Amara felt tears she hadn't realized she was crying slip down her cheeks. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission costing her everything. Amara Collins didn't admit fear. She faced challenges head-on, conquered them through sheer force of will. But this was bigger than anything she'd ever faced. In an instant, Damien was beside her, his large hands cradling her face with infinite gentleness. I'm scared too, he admitted, his thumbs brushing away her tears. But we're in this together now. Whether you like it or not, whether it's complicated or messy or completely insane, we're in this together. For a moment, she let herself lean into his touch, let herself remember what it felt like to not carry the weight of the world alone. But then reality crashed back, and she pulled away. Together, she laughed bitterly. Damien, I work for you. The press would have a field day if they found out the powerful CEO got his assistant pregnant. My career would be over before it started. Then we'll figure it out, he said firmly. We'll find a way to make it work. How? She demanded. How do we make this work when everything about it is impossible? Damien was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, certain. And we start with the truth, he said. The truth that what happened in Chicago wasn't a mistake. The truth that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you for 2 months. The truth that the idea of you carrying my child terrifies and thrills me in equal measure. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. And the truth that I want this, Amara. I want you, and I want our baby, and I want to figure out how to make this impossible situation work. Amara stared at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the hope he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the fantasy that they could somehow make this work. But the practical part of her, the part that had fought for everything she'd achieved, knew better. It's not that simple, she whispered. It is that simple, he countered. It's everything else that's complicated. Before she could respond, Dr. Mitchell knocked and entered again, her professional smile firmly in place. How are we doing in here? Ready to discuss next steps? Amara and Damien sprang apart, the spell of intimacy broken by the return to reality. But, as the doctor began discussing prenatal vitamins and follow-up appointments, Amara couldn't stop thinking about Damien's words. It is that simple. It's everything else that's complicated. And as Dr. Mitchell continued talking, as Damien listened intently to every instruction about caring for her and their unborn child, Amara realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't the pregnancy itself. It was how much she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make the impossible work. The discharge papers are signed. Reality waits outside the hospital doors, and both of their lives have just changed forever. The hospital lobby felt like stepping into another universe, one where their secret was no longer just theirs. The late afternoon sun painted Manhattan in shades of gold and amber as Amara and Damien stepped through the automatic doors of Mount Sinai Hospital. The real world rushed to meet them. Car horns, chattering pedestrians, the relentless pulse of a city that never stopped moving. After the sterile quiet of the hospital room, it felt overwhelming. Amara clutched the discharge papers in one hand, her purse in the other, trying to process the fact that her entire life had changed in the span of a few hours. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Damien Hawthorne's baby, and somehow she still couldn't quite believe it was real. "My driver is waiting," Damien said softly, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his palm. "I'll take you home." "I can take a cab," she replied automatically, the professional distance she'd perfected slipping back into place like armor. Old habits died hard, even when the world had been turned upside down. Damien stopped walking, turning to face her on the busy sidewalk. People flowed around them like water around stones, but he seemed completely oblivious to the crowd. His grey eyes were intense, focused entirely on her. "Amara, you just found out you're carrying my child. You're not taking a cab." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone he used in board meetings when he'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. "Please, let me take care of you." The word please did something to her resolve, the same way it had in the hospital room. Damien Hawthorne didn't beg. He commanded, he decided, he took charge. But with her, he asked. With her, he was different. She nodded reluctantly, and his shoulders visibly relaxed. The ride to her apartment in Brooklyn Heights was tense with unspoken words. Damien's sleek black sedan felt impossibly intimate after the clinical environment of the hospital. The leather seats, the soft classical music, the way he kept glancing at her as if she might disappear. It all felt too much like the car ride back from dinner in Chicago when the air between them had crackled with possibility and desire. "The Morrison deal," Amara said suddenly, needing to fill the silence with something safe and familiar. "Did we lose it?" Damien looked at her incredulously. "You're pregnant with my child and you're worried about the Morrison deal." "I'm worried about my job," she corrected, though even as she said it, she knew it was only partly true. Work had always been her anchor, her source of identity and control. Without it, she felt adrift. "Your job is secure, Amara. More than secure." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes serious. "But we need to discuss what happens next. How we handle this at the office, what we tell people." "We don't tell people anything," she said quickly. "This is private, personal. It doesn't affect our work." "Doesn't affect our work?" Damien's voice rose slightly. "Amara, you're having my baby. How does that not affect everything?" She turned to look out the window, watching Brooklyn's tree-lined streets blur past. "Because I can't let it. I've worked too hard to get where I am to let this derail my career." The silence that followed was heavy with hurt and frustration. When Damien spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "Is that what this is to you? A derailment?" The quiet pain in his voice made her chest tighten, but she forced herself not to look at him. "I don't know what this is yet. I need time to think." The car pulled up outside her building, a converted brownstone with large windows and a small garden courtyard. It was charming without being ostentatious, the kind of place a successful assistant executive could afford without attracting unwanted attention. "I'll walk you up," Damien said, already moving to open his door. "That's not necessary." "It's necessary to me." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a gentleness wrapped in steel that reminded her why he'd been so successful in business. He got what he wanted, but he made you want to give it to him. They rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence, the confined space making her hyper-aware of everything about him, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his suit jacket stretched across his broad shoulders, the careful distance he maintained, even though every cell in her body seemed to be pulling toward him. At her door, Amara fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly. Whether from the day's events or Damien's proximity, she couldn't tell. "Here," he said softly, covering her hands with his to steady them. The touch sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she had to suppress a shiver. "Let me." He took the keys gently, his fingers brushing hers as he unlocked the door. For a moment, they stood frozen in the hallway, his hands still covering hers, their faces inches apart. She could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could feel his breath warm against her skin. "Amara," he whispered, and she knew that if she let him say whatever was in his eyes, everything would change. Again, she stepped back quickly, breaking the spell. "Thank you for the ride." But instead of leaving, Damien followed her inside, closing the door behind him. Her apartment was exactly what he'd expected, elegant but comfortable, with warm colors and carefully chosen artwork. Books everywhere, a small piano in one corner, fresh flowers on the coffee table. It was quintessentially her, beautiful, sophisticated, and completely genuine. "Nice place," he said, but his attention wasn't on the decor. It was on her, on the way she was standing with her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. "Damien, you can't be here." Her voice was shaky, and they both knew it had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. "Why not?" "Because," she gestured helplessly, "because we're not anything. We work together, that's all." "That's all?" He stepped closer and she backed up until she hit the wall beside her bookshelf. He braced one hand against the wall next to her head, not trapping her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "So what happened in Chicago was nothing. It was a mistake," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "Look me in the eyes and tell me it was a mistake." His voice was low, rough with emotion. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't feel what I felt that night." She tried. God help her, she tried to lie, to maintain the professional distance that had kept her safe for 2 months. But looking into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability and hope and desperate longing there, she couldn't do it. "It doesn't matter what I felt," she said instead. "It can't happen again." "Why not?" "Because you're my boss. Because I work for you. Because if anyone finds out, then I'll quit." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I'll quit Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I'll sell my shares, step down from the board, whatever it takes." His other hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I won't let my position stand between us." "You can't do that," she breathed. "Sterling is your life. You built it from nothing." "I built it because I had nothing else to live for," he said simply. "But now I do. Now I have you and our baby, and the possibility of something I never thought I could have." "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "A family." The raw honesty in his voice, the way his mask had completely fallen away, made her knees weak. This wasn't the controlled CEO speaking. This was just Damien, the man who'd held her in the dark hours before dawn, who'd told her about losing his parents, who'd made her feel less alone in the world than she ever had before. "You don't know what you're saying," she said, but her protest was weak. "You don't know anything about me, about my life. I know you take your coffee black, but add sugar when you think no one's looking," he said softly. "I know you hum when you're concentrating, and you bite your lower lip when you're thinking hard about something. I know you're brilliant and driven and stronger than anyone I've ever met. I know you grew up in foster care, but put yourself through college and graduate school. I know you speak 3 languages and play piano and have nightmares sometimes that make you afraid to sleep." With each word, her defenses crumbled a little more. He did know her. Somehow, in the months they'd worked together, and the single night they'd shared, he'd seen her in ways that most people never did. "I know," he continued, his voice growing softer, "that you're terrified of needing anyone, because everyone you've ever needed has let you down. But I'm not going anywhere, Amara. Not this time." Tears she didn't remember starting to cry slipped down her cheeks. "Damien, let me in," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Let me be what you need. Let us try." For a moment, suspended in the golden afternoon light filtering through her windows, she let herself imagine it, letting down her guard, letting him in, building something real and lasting with this impossible man who saw straight through her carefully constructed walls. Then her phone rang. The spell shattered. Amara ducked under his arm, moving to grab her phone from her purse. The caller ID made her heart sink. Jessica Chen, Sterling Pharmaceuticals. "I have to take this," she said, already answering. "Hello? Amara, thank God you're okay." Jessica's voice was bright with relief. "Everyone's been talking about what happened in the presentation. Are you all right? What did the doctors say?" Amara's eyes met Damien's across the room. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm fine," she said into the phone, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Just exhaustion. I'll be back in the office tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Are you sure you should?" "I'm sure. Just a little rest and I'll be good as new." After she hung up, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Damien's face had shuttered again, the vulnerable man from moments before replaced by the controlled executive she knew so well. "Back to the office tomorrow," he said quietly. "Back to pretending nothing happened." Damien, "No, I get it." He straightened his tie, his movements sharp and precise. "You've made your position clear. We work together, that's all." "It's not that simple." "It is exactly that simple, Amara. You're either willing to try, or you're not. You either trust me or you don't." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "I'll have my lawyer draw up papers regarding the baby. Financial support, medical expenses, whatever you need. But if you want to keep pretending that what's between us doesn't exist." He turned to look at her one last time, and the pain in his eyes nearly brought her to her knees. "Then I'll pretend too." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Amara was alone. She sank onto her couch, one hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. Outside, the sounds of Brooklyn evening life filtered through her windows. Children playing, neighbors chatting, the distant hum of traffic. Normal sounds of normal life. But nothing about her life was normal anymore. And as she sat in her carefully ordered apartment, surrounded by the life she'd built through determination and independence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The golden light faded to evening shadows, and with it the possibility of something beautiful slipped further away. End of chapter 3. Tomorrow they'll return to the office. Tomorrow they'll pretend nothing has changed. But some secrets are too big to hide, and some connections are too powerful to deny. Walking into Sterling Pharmaceuticals felt like stepping into a minefield where every glance could be explosive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble lobby as Amara stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. She'd spent an hour perfecting her makeup to hide the exhaustion etched in every line of her face, choosing her most professional blazer, navy blue with sharp shoulders that made her feel armored and in control. But beneath the carefully constructed exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind with every click of her heels against the polished floor. She was carrying Damien Hawthorne's baby, and today she had to pretend that nothing had changed. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt endless. She'd deliberately arrived early, hoping to settle into her routine before facing the inevitable questions about yesterday's incident. But as the doors slid open on the 38th floor, she realized her plan had backfired. Damien stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, visible through the glass walls, his silhouette dark against the Manhattan skyline. Even from across the reception area, she could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the way he held himself with military precision. He was already here, already working, already pretending. Their eyes met through the glass for one electric moment. Time seemed to suspend itself. The bustling office faded away, leaving only the memory of his hands cradling her face, his voice rough with emotion, as he'd offered to give up everything for her. Then he looked away, turning back to his computer, as if she were nothing more than another employee arriving for work. The dismissal hit her like a slap, even though she'd asked for exactly this: professional distance, pretending. The careful dance they'd perfected over the past 2 months, now with the added weight of a secret that felt like it might crush them both. "Amara," Jessica's bright voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You look so much better. I was worried sick yesterday." "Just needed some rest," Amara replied, forcing a smile as she settled behind her desk. The familiar routine felt surreal, checking emails, reviewing Damien's schedule, preparing for the day ahead as if her entire world hadn't shifted on its axis. "The Morrison people called this morning," Jessica continued, perching on the edge of Amara's desk. "They want to reschedule the presentation for Thursday. Apparently Mr. Hawthorne called them personally yesterday to apologize for the interruption." Of course he had. Even in crisis, even when his world was imploding, Damien took care of business. It was one of the things she couldn't let her mind go there. Not here, not now. "I'll add it to his calendar," she said briskly. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings, each interaction feeling slightly unreal. Amara threw herself into work with fierce determination, using the familiar tasks as armor against the chaos in her mind. But every time Damien's voice carried from his office, every time she glimpsed him through the glass walls, her concentration shattered. At 11:30, her computer chimed with a calendar reminder: "Weekly strategy meeting, conference room A." Her stomach dropped. The weekly strategy meeting. 2 hours in a conference room with Damien and the senior staff, sitting across from him, taking notes, pretending that less than 24 hours ago He'd offered to quit everything for her. She gathered her files with hands that trembled slightly, telling herself it was low blood sugar, pregnancy symptoms, anything but the effect of knowing she'd be in the same room as the father of her child, breathing the same air, watching his mouth move as he spoke, and remembering how those lips had felt against her skin. The conference room was already half full when she arrived. Amara took her usual seat, second chair from the wall, perfect angle to take notes and observe without being conspicuous. She'd chosen this spot months ago for its strategic advantages. Now it felt like torture. Damien entered exactly on time, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He wore a charcoal grey suit that made his eyes look like storm clouds, his dark hair perfectly styled, despite the fact that she'd seen him run his hands through it in frustration just yesterday. He looked every inch the powerful CEO, controlled, confident, completely unaffected. Only Amara caught the slight tightness around his eyes, the careful way he avoided looking in her direction. "Let's begin," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "Marketing wants to discuss the Q3 campaign strategy for the neurological division." The meeting proceeded normally, presentations, discussions, the usual corporate choreography that Amara could navigate in her sleep. She took notes with mechanical precision, her handwriting neat and controlled even as her pulse raced every time Damien spoke. Then, 40 minutes in, disaster struck in the most mundane way possible. Amara reached for her water glass at the exact moment Damien leaned forward to examine a document. Their fingers brushed, barely a whisper of contact, but the effect was electric. The touch sent sparks shooting up her arm, and she jerked back so quickly that she knocked over her water glass. Ice water spread across the polished conference table, soaking into reports and pooling around laptops. The room erupted in concerned chatter as people grabbed papers and napkins, but all Amara could focus on was the way Damien had gone completely still. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, grabbing napkins to clean up the mess. "I don't know what—" "It's fine," Damien said, but his voice was strained. He handed her his handkerchief, monogrammed linen that smelled faintly of his cologne, and their fingers brushed again as she took it. This time neither of them pulled away immediately. The touch lasted perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity in a room full of colleagues. When they finally broke contact, the air between them crackled with enough electricity to power half of Manhattan. "Perhaps we should take a short break," announced Patricia Wells, the head of marketing, glancing between them with barely concealed curiosity. As the room emptied, Amara found herself alone with Damien and a puddle of water that felt like a metaphor for how thoroughly she was drowning. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, moving to help her gather the soggy papers. "I'm fine," she said quickly, not looking at him. "Just clumsy." "Amara." Her name was a whisper, spoken so softly that only she could hear it. "Look at me." She made the mistake of lifting her eyes to his, and what she saw there nearly undid her completely. Concern, longing, and something that looked suspiciously like the same desperate need that was clawing at her insides. "This isn't working," he said, his voice barely audible. "It has to work," she whispered back. "Does it?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we're both miserable." Before she could respond, the conference room door opened, and Patricia Wells returned, followed by the rest of the team. Damien stepped back smoothly, his professional mask sliding into place so seamlessly that Amara almost wondered if she'd imagined the moment of vulnerability. But she hadn't imagined it. The air still hummed with tension, and she could feel curious glances from their colleagues as the meeting resumed. The rest of the session passed without incident, but Amara barely absorbed a word. Her focus was entirely consumed by the man sitting across from her, the careful way he held himself, the unconscious gesture he made when he was thinking deeply, the way his voice changed slightly when he addressed her directly. When the meeting finally ended, Amara was the first to escape, practically fleeing to the safety of her office. But even there, surrounded by the familiar chaos of ringing phones and endless emails, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was coming apart at the seams. The afternoon brought a new form of torture: dictation. Damien called her into his office at 3 o'clock, his voice professionally neutral over the intercom. "I need to dictate some correspondence." It was routine, something they'd done hundreds of times over the past year. Amara would sit in the chair across from his desk, tablet ready, while he paced and dictated letters, memos, and reports. It was efficient, productive, and usually completely impersonal. Today it felt like intimate torture. The moment she stepped into his office, the air grew thick with unspoken words. Damien stood behind his desk, his hands braced against the leather surface, looking like a man barely holding himself together. "Close the door," he said without looking up. The soft click of the door seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Amara moved to her usual chair, tablet ready, trying to ignore the way her hands were shaking. "Ready when you are," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Damien began to pace, his movements fluid and controlled, but Amara could see the tension coiled in every line of his body. He dictated a memo about quarterly projections, his voice crisp and professional, while she typed with mechanical precision. But as he moved around the office, the formal distance began to feel increasingly artificial. This was the man who'd held her through the night in Chicago, who'd whispered her name like a prayer, who'd offered to give up everything for her just yesterday. Now they were pretending to be nothing more than boss and assistant, and the pretense was suffocating them both. "Which brings us to the matter of long-term strategic planning," Damien was saying, but his voice had grown rougher, less controlled. "We need to consider the implications of unexpected developments that might affect our corporate structure." Amara's fingers stilled on the tablet. Was he talking about quarterly projections, or about them? "Should I note that as a separate agenda item?" she asked carefully. Damien stopped pacing, turning to face her fully for the first time since she'd entered the office. "What do you think, Ms. Collins? How should we handle unexpected complications that might disrupt our established procedures?" The question hung between them, loaded with double meaning. They were talking about memos and strategic planning, but they might as well have been discussing the baby growing inside her, the impossible situation they found themselves in. "I think," Amara said slowly, "that sometimes unexpected complications can lead to better outcomes, if handled properly." "And what constitutes proper handling?" His voice was soft now, intense, his grey eyes fixed on her face. "Honesty," she whispered, "clear communication, being willing to adapt when circumstances change." They stared at each other across the expanse of his office, the professional pretense wearing thinner with every shared breath. The late afternoon sun slanted through his windows, casting them both in golden light, and for a moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world to close the distance between them. Then Damien's phone rang, shattering the spell. He answered curtly, his attention immediately claimed by what was apparently an urgent call from the board of directors. Amara used the interruption to escape, gathering her things and slipping out of his office before the call ended. Back at her desk, she tried to focus on the routine tasks that usually grounded her, but her mind kept replaying the charged conversation, the way he'd looked at her, the undercurrent of longing that had threaded through even their most professional exchanges. As the office began to empty for the evening, Amara found herself working later than usual, unable to face the thought of going home to her empty apartment where she'd have nothing to distract her from the chaos in her mind. She was so absorbed in reviewing contracts that she didn't notice Damien approaching her desk until his shadow fell across her papers. "It's past 7, he said quietly. "You should go home." "I'm almost finished," she replied without looking up, hyper-aware of his presence beside her desk. "Amara." The way he said her name made her look up despite herself. "You need to eat dinner. You need to rest. He paused, glancing around to make sure they were alone before continuing in a lower voice. "You're carrying my child. I can't stand by and watch you exhaust yourself." The genuine concern in his voice, the careful way he acknowledged their situation while maintaining the necessary discretion, made her chest tighten with emotions she couldn't name. "I can take care of myself," she said, but the protest lacked conviction. "I know you can," he replied gently, "but you don't have to. Not anymore." The simple statement hung between them like a lifeline, an offer of support, of partnership, of something she'd never allowed herself to want. For a moment, in the quiet emptiness of the evening office, surrounded by the detritus of corporate life, she let herself imagine accepting that offer, letting him take care of her, building something real and lasting despite all the complications. Then reality crashed back, and she began gathering her things with brisk efficiency. "I should go," she said. "Long day tomorrow." Damien nodded, stepping back to give her space, but his eyes never left her face. "Amara," he said as she reached the elevator, "this isn't over." It wasn't a threat or a promise, just a simple statement of fact that made her pulse race and her heart ache in equal measure. The elevator doors closed between them, but the truth remained. Some things were too powerful to hide, even behind the thickest walls of professional pretense. Another day of pretending, another night of wanting what seems impossible. But in the morning they'll have to face each other again, and the mask is getting harder to maintain. Some masks are meant to crack, and when they do, everything beautiful and terrifying underneath comes rushing out. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning, and Amara knew it was going to be a disaster before she even stepped into the room. She'd spent Thursday night tossing and turning, her body caught between exhaustion and the restless energy that seemed to pulse through her whenever she thought about Damien, which was constantly. The morning sickness had gotten worse, waves of nausea that left her gripping the bathroom counter and wondering how she was going to keep hiding this from everyone. But it wasn't just the pregnancy symptoms that had her on edge. It was the way Damien had been looking at her all week, like he was barely holding himself back from doing something that would shatter their carefully maintained professional facade. It was the charged silences, the accidental touches that lasted a heartbeat too long, the way her name sounded different when he said it. It was the fact that she was falling apart, piece by piece, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it together. The boardroom was already full when she arrived with her notes and tablet. The usual collection of Sterling Pharmaceuticals' most powerful executives arranged around the polished mahogany table. Amara took her place in the chair along the wall, close enough to provide support but removed from the main discussion, and tried to ignore the way her pulse spiked when Damien entered the room. He looked tired, she realized with a pang of concern that she had no right to feel. There were subtle lines of stress around his eyes, and his usually perfect hair showed signs of the restless hand-running she'd witnessed through his office windows all week. He wore his authority like armor, but she could see the cracks. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Damien began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "We need to discuss the Meridian acquisition and its timeline." Amara settled into the familiar rhythm of note-taking, her fingers flying across the tablet as she transcribed the rapid-fire discussion of market projections and due diligence timelines. It was complex, high-stakes corporate maneuvering that normally would have engaged her completely. Instead, she found herself stealing glances at Damien, watching the way he commanded the room with quiet intensity. This was where he belonged, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, building the empire he'd created from nothing. The thought of him giving it all up, the offer he'd made in her apartment, sent a stab of guilt through her chest. "The regulatory approval could take 18 months, board member Ronald Hartley was saying, his gravelly voice cutting through her distraction. "That's assuming we don't hit any unexpected complications." Unexpected complications. The phrase made Amara's pen slip, leaving an ink blot on her otherwise pristine notes. She could feel Damien's eyes on her from across the room, could sense the shift in his attention, even though she didn't dare look up. "Complications are part of any major acquisition," Damien replied smoothly. "The key is anticipating them and having contingency plans in place." "Easy to say," piped up Sandra Morrison, the silver-haired head of legal. "But some complications can't be planned for. Personal scandals, conflicts of interest, anything that might affect public perception of the company." Amara's blood turned to ice. The words weren't directed at her specifically, but they felt like arrows aimed straight at her chest. Personal scandals, conflicts of interest, everything she and Damien were desperately trying to avoid. "Which is why we maintain the highest standards of professional conduct at all levels," Damien said, but there was a slight tightness to his voice that only Amara seemed to catch. "Sterling Pharmaceuticals has built its reputation on integrity and transparency." The irony was suffocating. Here they sat discussing integrity and transparency, while she carried his child, and they both pretended nothing had changed between them. The weight of the secret felt crushing, and suddenly the elegant boardroom with its panoramic view of Manhattan felt like a prison. Amara tried to focus on her breathing, on the mundane task of taking notes, but the room seemed to be tilting slightly. The familiar wave of nausea rolled through her stomach, stronger this time, accompanied by a dizzy rush that made the voices around the table sound distant and muffled. "Not now," she pleaded silently. "Not here." But her body had other plans. The pen slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. Several board members glanced in her direction, but Amara was beyond caring about the attention. The nausea was building to a crescendo, and she knew with horrible certainty that she was about to be sick. In front of everyone, in front of Damien. She bolted from her chair with a whispered, "Excuse me," one hand pressed to her mouth as she rushed toward the door. Behind her, She could hear the surprised murmurs of the board members, could feel their curious eyes following her hasty exit. But it was Damien's voice that stopped her at the door, sharp with barely concealed panic. "Amara, wait." She didn't stop, couldn't stop. The hallway blurred past as she made a desperate dash for the nearest bathroom, barely making it into a stall before her stomach betrayed her completely. The retching was violent and humiliating, her body purging itself while her mind reeled with the implications of what had just happened. She'd run out of the most important board meeting of the quarter, in front of the company's most senior executives, looking exactly like what she was, a woman in the early stages of pregnancy struggling to keep it together. When the worst of it passed, she slumped against the cool metal wall of the bathroom stall, tears of frustration and fear streaming down her cheeks. How was she going to explain this? How was she going to face those people again? Pretend it was just a stomach bug or stress or anything other than the truth that felt too big and dangerous to contain. The bathroom door opened, and Amara heard the soft click of expensive heels on tile. "Amara? Honey, are you all right?" Sandra Morrison's voice was gentler than Amara had ever heard it, filled with what sounded like genuine concern. The older woman had always been intimidating, brilliant, sharp-tongued, utterly professional, but now she sounded almost maternal. "I'm fine," Amara called weakly, trying to pull herself together. "Just something I ate, I think." There was a pause, then Sandra's voice again, closer this time. "May I come in?" Before Amara could protest, the stall door opened. Sandra took one look at her, pale, shaky, clearly struggling, and her expression softened with understanding. "Oh, sweetheart," she said quietly. "How far along are you?" The question hit Amara like a physical blow. There was no judgment in Sandra's voice, no accusation, just the quiet recognition of one woman who'd been through this recognizing another who was struggling with the same challenges. "I don't know what you mean," Amara whispered, but the protest was weak. Sandra handed her a tissue, her movement gentle. "I have 3 daughters, dear. I know morning sickness when I see it." She paused, studying Amara's face with shrewd eyes. "The question is, does he know?" Amara didn't have to ask who he was. The way Sandra had watched the interaction in the boardroom, the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most successful corporate lawyers in the city. Of course, she'd picked up on the undercurrents between Amara and Damien. "Sandra, please, your secret is safe with me," the older woman said firmly. "But honey, you can't keep doing this to yourself. The stress, the pretending, it's not good for you or the baby." Tears spilled over despite Amara's attempts to control them. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. "I don't know how to make this work." Sandra was quiet for a moment, then reached out to squeeze Amara's shoulder. "You start by taking care of yourself, and you stop trying to handle everything alone." She paused. "That young man of yours is about ready to tear the building apart looking for you. He sent me in here because he was afraid it would cause more speculation if he came himself." The thought of Damien pacing outside the bathroom, torn between concern and the need to maintain their professional cover, made Amara's chest ache. "This is such a mess." "All the best love stories are messy, dear," Sandra said with a small smile. "The question is whether you're brave enough to fight for what matters." Before Amara could respond, Sandra was gone, leaving her alone with her turbulent thoughts and the echo of words that hit far too close to home. Fight for what matters. Amara splashed cold water on her face, trying to repair the damage to her makeup and compose herself for the inevitable return to the boardroom. But when she opened the bathroom door, she found Damien waiting in the hallway, his face etched with worry that he wasn't bothering to hide. "Are you all right?" The question came out rougher than he probably intended, his professional mask completely absent. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice shook. "No, you're not." He stepped closer, and she could see the barely leashed panic in his grey eyes. "Amara, this has to stop. You're making yourself sick trying to pretend." "Pretend what?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, defensive and raw. "Pretend that we're not completely screwed. Pretend that there's some magical solution that makes this work without destroying both our careers. I told you I'd quit. And I told you that's insane." The dam finally burst, months of suppressed emotion pouring out in a rush of words she couldn't take back. "You built Sterling from nothing. It's your life's work, your legacy. I won't be the reason you throw it all away. Then what do you suggest?" His voice was rising now, professional discretion abandoned in the face of his frustration. "Because watching you make yourself sick, watching you run away from me every day, watching you pretend that what's between us doesn't exist, I can't do it anymore, Amara. I can't. They were standing in the middle of the executive hallway, voices echoing off marble walls, completely exposed to anyone who might walk by. It was professional suicide, and they both knew it. But something had broken between them, some carefully maintained barrier that had finally cracked under the pressure of too many secrets and too much longing. "What do you want from me?" Amara demanded, tears streaming down her face now. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me you feel it too," Damien said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I want you to stop running away every time I get close. I want you to admit that what happened in Chicago was the most real thing either of us has ever experienced." The words hung between them like a challenge, like a dare. In the distance, Amara could hear the soft hum of office life continuing around them, phones ringing, printers whirring, the mundane sounds of a world that suddenly felt very far away. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. "It's the only thing that matters." Damien reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that was intimate and desperate and completely inappropriate for their corporate surroundings. "Amara, I'm falling apart without you. These past 2 months have been hell and I can't keep pretending anymore." She stared at their joined hands, at the way his fingers fit perfectly between hers, and felt something inside her chest crack wide open. This was madness. This was professional suicide. This was everything she'd spent her career avoiding, and it was the most honest moment she'd had in months. "The board meeting," she started weakly. "Can wait," he finished. "They'll assume you had a stomach bug. Sandra will cover for us. She's good at managing crises." The mention of Sandra made Amara remember the older woman's words. All the best love stories are messy. Maybe it was time to stop fighting the mess. Maybe it was time to be brave. "Damien," she whispered, his name a prayer and a surrender all at once. And then, in the middle of the executive hallway of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, with their careers and reputations hanging in the balance, Amara Collins finally stopped running. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, and watched as his careful control shattered completely. "I feel it too," she admitted, the words barely audible. "God help me, I feel it too." The confession hung between them like a bridge, fragile and terrifying and absolutely necessary. And for the first time in months, neither of them looked away. The mask is gone. The truth is out. And now they'll have to face what comes next. Together. The truth has a way of making everything both clearer and more complicated at the same time. The silence in Damien's private office felt different now, charged with possibility instead of painful restraint. Amara sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, trying to process the fact that everything had changed in the span of a single hallway conversation. They'd managed to return to the boardroom with some semblance of composure, Sandra smoothly covering for Amara's absence, with mentions of a stomach bug that had been going around. The meeting had concluded without further incident, but the undercurrent of tension between Amara and Damien had been impossible to miss. Now, in the golden late afternoon light, filtering through his floor-to-ceiling windows, they faced each other without pretense, for the first time in months. "So," Damien said quietly, his voice still rough from their emotional confrontation. He'd loosened his tie and run his hands through his hair so many times that it no longer looked perfectly styled. "Where do we go from here?" Amara studied his face, the sharp jawline she'd traced with trembling fingers, the steel-grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, the mouth that had whispered her name like a benediction in the dark hours before dawn in Chicago. He looked vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before, as if admitting his feelings had stripped away the last of his protective armor. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Neither have I. The closest I've come to mixing business with pleasure was taking clients to dinner." The admission surprised her. For all his confidence and success, Damien had always maintained rigid boundaries between his professional and personal life. The fact that she had been the exception, that Chicago had been as unprecedented for him as it had been for her, sent a warm flutter through her chest. "The board meeting," she started, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Is handled. Sandra will ensure that no one asks uncomfortable questions about your sudden exit." His expression grew more serious. "But we need to discuss what happens next. For you, for the baby, for us." The word us hung in the air between them, fragile and hopeful. It felt strange to acknowledge that there could be an us beyond their professional relationship, beyond the single night that had changed everything. "I made an appointment," Amara said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them, "with an obstetrician, Dr. Emily Rodriguez at Mount Sinai. It's next Thursday." Damien leaned forward, his attention completely focused on her. Would you want me to come with you?" The careful way he asked, as if he was afraid she might reject the offer, made her chest tight with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that." Relief flooded his features, and for a moment he looked younger, less burdened by the weight of corporate responsibility. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the enormity of their situation settling around them like a warm blanket. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual Friday afternoon energy, but inside Damien's office, the world felt smaller, more manageable. "We'll need to be careful," Amara said eventually, her practical nature reasserting itself, "about how we handle this publicly. The company, the media, the board." "I know." Damien's voice was steady, but she could see the tension creeping back into his shoulders. "I've been thinking about that. There are ways to manage the situation that protect both of us, such as—" He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authoritative tone he used in board meetings, but softer, more personal. "We could start by not hiding our relationship entirely. Let people see us together occasionally. Dinner, company events. Let them get used to the idea that we're involved." He paused. "Then when we're ready to announce the pregnancy, it won't be completely shocking." Amara considered this, turning the plan over in her mind. It made sense from a public relations standpoint, a gradual revelation rather than a bombshell announcement. But it also meant acknowledging that they had a relationship worth protecting, worth building something on. "That could work," she said slowly. "But what about my position here? People will say I slept my way to the top, that any success I have is because of this." The pain in her voice made Damien's expression harden. "Anyone who knows you, who's seen your work, would never think that. You're brilliant, Amara. You've earned every opportunity you've gotten here. But they don't know that," she said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "All they'll see is the assistant who got pregnant by the boss." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed her concern. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What if you weren't my assistant anymore?" Amara's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "There's an opening in strategic development, director level. It's a significant promotion. Your own team, your own projects, complete autonomy." His grey eyes were intense, focused entirely on her face. "The position reports to the VP of Development, not to me directly. It would remove any appearance of impropriety." The offer was generous. More than generous, it was exactly the kind of career advancement she'd been working toward for years. But the way he presented it, the careful neutrality in his voice, made her stomach drop. "You want to transfer me to get me away from you," she said, the words coming out flatter than she'd intended. "No." The response was immediate and emphatic. "I want to give you the career you deserve, without anyone being able to question how you got it. I want to protect you from the kind of speculation that could damage your reputation." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she found instead was genuine concern, the look of a man trying to solve a problem that had no perfect solution. "And you think this would work? That people wouldn't still talk?" "People will always talk," he said honestly. "But this way, when they do, you'll have a track record of success that has nothing to do with me. You'll have built something on your own merit." It was logical, practical, and probably the smartest path forward. It was also terrifying in a way she couldn't quite name. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Take all the time you need. The position isn't going anywhere." Another silence fell between them, but this one was less comfortable, weighted with the complexity of decisions that would affect both their futures. Amara found herself studying the view from his windows, the Manhattan skyline bathed in golden afternoon light, the city that had become home, the world that suddenly felt both more solid and more fragile than before. "Damien," she said softly, not looking at him. "What do you want? Really want, I mean. Not what's practical or smart or good for the company. What do you want?" When she finally turned to face him, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was longing there, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked like hope wrapped in determination. "I want to take you home," he said quietly. "I want to cook you dinner and make sure you're eating enough. I want to go to doctor's appointments and argue about baby names and feel our child kick for the first time. His voice grew softer, more vulnerable. I want to wake up next to you and not have it be a one-time mistake. I want to build something real with you, Amara. Something that lasts. The words washed over her like a tide, carrying away the last of her carefully constructed defenses. This was the man she'd glimpsed in Chicago. Not the controlled CEO, but the person underneath. The one who'd held her through the night and made her feel less alone in the world than she ever had before. I want that too, she whispered, the admission costing her everything and giving her everything in return. It terrifies me, but I want it too. Damien's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. He stood slowly, moving around his desk with the careful grace she'd always admired, and knelt beside her chair. His hands found hers, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that spoke of deeper connection. Then let's be terrified together, he said, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Let's figure this out as we go. The simple gesture, intimate without being inappropriate, tender without being possessive, made her feel more cherished than any grand romantic gesture could have. This was what she'd been afraid to want, someone who saw her completely and chose to stay anyway. Okay, she said, the word barely a whisper but carrying the weight of a lifetime of decisions. Okay. They stayed like that for a moment, hands linked, hearts open, the future stretching out before them like an unmapped territory full of possibility and challenge in equal measure. Then Damien's phone buzzed with an urgent message, breaking the spell and reminding them both that they were still in his office, still surrounded by the corporate world that would demand explanations and strategies and carefully managed revelations. I should go, Amara said, reluctantly pulling her hands free. People will start to wonder if I'm in here too long. Wait. Damien stood, moving to his desk and pulling out a business card. He wrote something on the back before handing it to her. My personal number, not the company line. Amara looked down at the card, at his bold handwriting spelling out digits that felt like a secret code to a different world. A world where they could be themselves instead of boss and assistant, where they could explore the connection that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Text me when you get home, he said. Let me know you're safe. The request was simple, but it carried the weight of a promise, that he would be there, that he cared, that she wasn't alone anymore. I will, she said, slipping the card into her purse. As she reached for the door handle, his voice stopped her one last time. Amara. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression that made her knees weak. Thank you, for trusting me with this, for trusting me with you. She smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him since Chicago. And something in the air between them shifted. The painful tension that had characterized their interactions for months was gone, replaced by something warmer, more hopeful, something that felt like the beginning of everything. The office door closed behind her, but for the first time in months it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the start of something beautiful and terrifying, and absolutely worth fighting for. Trust has been given, promises have been made, and in the golden light of a Friday afternoon, two people who've been pretending they didn't need each other finally stopped lying to themselves. Saturday morning felt different when you weren't pretending anymore. Amara stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to calm the butterflies that had taken residence in her stomach. It wasn't morning sickness this time. It was pure, undiluted nervousness. In 2 hours, Damien would pick her up for what could only be described as their first real date. Their first anything really outside of that single night in Chicago and the sterile confines of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. She'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a soft burgundy sweater that brought out the warm undertones in her skin and dark jeans that were comfortable enough for whatever he had planned. The outfit was casual but polished, approachable but still unmistakably her. She'd left her hair down, loose curls that framed her face in a way that felt more natural than the sleek buns she wore to work. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, and Damien's name appeared on the screen. Just seeing it there in her personal space rather than on her work phone sent a flutter of warmth through her chest. On my way. Hope you're hungry, she typed back quickly. Always. See you soon. The response came immediately. Can't wait. 2 simple words that made her smile like a teenager with her first crush. This was ridiculous, she told herself. She was 28 years old, a successful executive, carrying this man's child. She shouldn't feel like a nervous schoolgirl about a simple dinner, but as she applied a final coat of lip gloss and grabbed her purse, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something momentous, the first step into whatever they were going to become. Damien arrived precisely on time, a trait she'd always appreciated about him in business that felt even more meaningful in this context. When she opened the door to her apartment, the sight of him nearly took her breath away. She'd seen him in countless expensive suits, had memorized the way he commanded boardrooms and dominated conference calls, but this version of Damien, wearing dark jeans and a charcoal cashmere sweater that clung to his broad shoulders, his hair slightly less perfectly styled than usual, was somehow more devastating than any corporate armor. He looked approachable, real, like the man who'd held her through the night in Chicago rather than the untouchable CEO who occupied the corner office. "Hi?" he said simply, but his grey eyes were doing things that made her pulse race. "Hi yourself," she managed, grabbing her coat from the hook beside the door. "Where are we going?" "That depends," he said, helping her into her jacket with a gentleness that made her skin tingle where his fingers brushed her shoulders. "How do you feel about surprises?" "I like to know what I'm getting into," she admitted as they walked toward the elevator. It was true. Amara had built her life on careful planning and controlled outcomes. Surprises were dangerous things that could disrupt the order she'd worked so hard to maintain. Damien smiled, pressing the button for the lobby. "Trust me." The question carried weight beyond their current destination. Trust him with this evening. Trust him with her heart. Trust him with the future they were tentatively building together. She met his gaze in the elevator's polished steel doors and nodded. "I trust you." His car was waiting outside, not the sleek corporate sedan with driver that he used for business, but a silver Audi that he drove himself. The gesture felt significant, another sign that this was personal rather than professional. "Music preference?" he asked as they pulled away from her building, heading toward Manhattan. "Surprise me," she said, feeling bold. "Apparently I'm trying new things." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that she realized she'd never heard in the office. This was Damien without the weight of corporate responsibility on his shoulders, and the transformation was mesmerizing. The restaurant he chose was perfect, a small Italian place in Soho that managed to be both intimate and unassuming, the kind of place where they could talk without shouting over noise, where the lighting was warm and flattering, where the staff was professional enough to respect their privacy without being intrusive. "How did you find this place?" Amara asked as they were seated at a corner table with exposed brick walls and candles that cast dancing shadows across their faces. "I used to come here with my parents when I was younger," Damien said, his voice carrying a note of nostalgia. "Before the accident, my mother loved the risotto and my father would always order whatever wine the owner recommended, even if it was completely wrong for the meal." It was the first time he'd mentioned his parents in such a personal way, and Amara felt honored that he'd chosen to share the memory with her. "They sound wonderful." They were. His smile was soft, but tinged with sadness. "They would have loved you, I think. My mother especially. She had no patience for people who weren't genuine, and she would have seen right through any pretense to the amazing woman underneath." The compliment made her chest warm, but it was the wistfulness in his voice that really affected her. She'd known the basic facts of his tragedy. Orphaned at 19, built his empire from insurance money and sheer determination. But sitting across from him in the candlelight, seeing the vulnerability in his expression, she understood for the first time how much that loss had shaped him. "Tell me about them," she said softly, and he did. Over antipasto and wine, sparkling water for her, he painted pictures with words of parents who'd been devoted to each other and to their only son. His father, an engineer with a dry sense of humor and an inability to fix anything around the house despite his profession. His mother, a teacher who'd made their modest home feel like a palace and who'd believed that Damien could accomplish anything he set his mind to. "She was the one who encouraged me to take business classes," he said, twirling pasta around his fork. "Said I had a gift for seeing the big picture. Dad wanted me to follow him into engineering, but Mom, she saw something different." "She was right," Amara said. "You have an incredible vision for Sterling. The way you see opportunities that others miss. The way you bring people together around a common goal. It's remarkable." Damien looked up from his plate, surprise flickering across his features. "You really think that? I've watched you for over a year, Damien. I've seen you turn impossible situations into opportunities, make decisions that others were afraid to make. Yes, I think that." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What I don't understand is why you doubt it." He was quiet for a moment, considering her question. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, introspective. I suppose because I built Sterling partly to prove something. To myself, to the world, to them. He gestured vaguely upward. I wanted to create something that would make them proud, something that honored what they'd given me. But somewhere along the way, it became everything. My identity, my purpose, my entire life. Until Chicago, she said softly. Until Chicago, he agreed. Until you made me remember that there might be more to life than quarterly projections and market share. The admission hung between them like a gift, intimate and precious. Amara felt something shift inside her chest, not just attraction or chemistry, but something deeper, understanding, connection, the recognition that they'd both been hiding behind their professional achievements, using success as a shield against the messier, more complicated business of actually living. Your turn, Damien said, refilling her water glass. Tell me about growing up. I know the basic facts from your personnel file, but I want to hear your version. Amara hesitated. Her childhood wasn't something she discussed often, not because it was tragic exactly, but because it was complicated in ways that made people uncomfortable. Foster care stories were either heartwarming tales of triumph or devastating narratives of abuse, but hers had been something more nuanced, more real. I was lucky, she said finally. Not in the traditional sense, but lucky in the people I encountered. The families who took me in weren't perfect, but most of them were good. They taught me things, how to be independent, how to adapt, how to find stability in myself rather than in circumstances. That explains a lot, Damien said, his tone gentle but perceptive. Your strength, your self-reliance, the way you handle pressure. It also explains why I'm terrified of needing people, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Every time I got comfortable somewhere, something changed. New family, new school, new rules. I learned early that the only person I could count on was myself. Damien reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The gesture was simple, but it sent warmth shooting up her arm and straight to her heart. You can count on me, he said quietly. I know that's easy to say and harder to prove, but you can count on me, Amara. She looked down at their joined hands, his larger, warmer, completely engulfing hers, and felt something inside her chest crack open, not break, but open, like a flower turning toward sunlight after a long winter. I'm trying to learn how, she whispered. The waiter appeared to clear their plates, breaking the intimate moment, but not the connection that hummed between them. They ordered dessert to share, tiramisu that arrived with 2 spoons and tasted like coffee and dreams. Can I ask you something? Amara said, as Damien handed her another spoonful of the decadent dessert. Anything. Why haven't you ever married? Had a family? The question was bold, perhaps too personal for a first date, but she needed to know. You're successful, attractive, obviously capable of commitment. Why were you alone? Damien was quiet for so long that she wondered if she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost distant. I convinced myself I didn't have time. That building Sterling required all my focus, all my energy. But the truth is, he paused, meeting her eyes across the small table. The truth is, I never met anyone who made me want to try, who made me believe that what we could build together would be worth more than what I could accomplish alone. And now? The question came out breathier than she'd intended. His smile was soft but certain, transforming his entire face. Now I know better. The drive back to her apartment felt different from the trip into the city, charged with possibility, and weighted with the significance of what had passed between them over dinner. They'd crossed some invisible threshold, moved beyond attraction and chemistry into something that felt startlingly like the foundation of a real relationship. Thank you, Amara said as Damien walked her to her building's entrance. For tonight, for everything. Thank you for trusting me with it, he replied. For letting me take you somewhere my parents would have loved. For sharing pieces of yourself that I know aren't easy to share. They stood on the sidewalk in the gentle glow of streetlights, the sounds of Brooklyn Saturday night providing a soft soundtrack to the moment. Amara felt the pull between them, not just physical, though that was certainly there, but emotional, the desire to extend the evening, to not let this perfect bubble of intimacy burst quite yet. Would you like to come up? She asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. For coffee? Damien's eyes searched her face and she could see him weighing the invitation, considering all its implications. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, but firm. I would love nothing more, he said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. But not tonight. The rejection stung, even though she understood it. Why not? Because when I come up to your apartment, when we take that next step, I want it to be because we're ready. Not because we're caught up in the moment, not because we're trying to recreate what we had in Chicago. His thumb traced her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. I want it to be because we've built something real that's worth building on. The explanation was logical, thoughtful, and absolutely maddening in its rightness. It was also quintessentially Damien, thinking several moves ahead, protecting both of them from making decisions they might regret. "You're right," she said, though part of her wanted to argue. "I hate it, but you're right." He laughed softly. "I'll make it up to you. Tomorrow, would you like to do something? Nothing fancy, just time together." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "What did you have in mind?" "Surprise," he said with a grin that made her stomach flutter. "I promise it's a good one." He leaned down then, pressing a kiss to her forehead that was tender and promising, and somehow more intimate than anything they'd shared in Chicago. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of patience and intention and a future worth waiting for. "Good night, Amara," he whispered against her hair. "Good night, Damien." She watched him walk back to his car, noting the way he moved with unconscious confidence, the way he turned to give her one last smile before driving away. Only when his taillights had disappeared around the corner did she finally head inside. Her apartment felt different when she entered it, still hers, still the sanctuary she'd created through years of careful arrangement, but somehow larger, more hopeful, as if the evening had opened windows she hadn't realized were closed. She was getting ready for bed when her phone buzzed with a text from Damien. "Thank you for a perfect evening. Sweet dreams," she typed back. "Thank you for reminding me what perfect feels like." The response came quickly. That was just the beginning. And as Amara fell asleep that night, one hand unconsciously resting on her still flat stomach, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some beginnings were worth the risk. One perfect evening, a foundation laid in honesty and tiramisu, and the promise of something beautiful just beginning to bloom. Some moments change everything, and the first heartbeat you hear together is one of them. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Manhattan feel electric with possibility. Amara stood in front of her bathroom mirror, smoothing her hands over the soft fabric of her dress, a deep emerald green that made her skin glow and disguised any subtle changes her body might already be showing. 11 weeks. That's what Dr. Rodriguez would likely confirm today, based on the timeline they'd calculated from her last period. 11 weeks since Chicago. Since the night that had changed everything, since she and Damien had created the tiny life growing inside her. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Leaving the office now. See you in 20 minutes. She typed back, "I'll be ready." The response was immediate. "We're in this together." The heart emoji made her smile. Such a small gesture. But from Damien Hawthorne, who conducted most of his digital communication in crisp, professional sentences, it felt like a love letter. When she opened the door to him 20 minutes later, she was struck again by how different he looked outside the corporate environment. Today he wore dark jeans and a navy button-down that made his grey eyes look like storm clouds, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms that she remembered from Chicago. He looked younger, more approachable, and utterly devastating. "Ready?" he asked. But his eyes were doing that thing they'd been doing since their dinner Saturday, looking at her like she was something precious he was afraid might disappear. "As ready as one can be for something like this," she admitted, grabbing her purse and jacket. The drive to Mount Sinai was comfortable in a way that surprised her. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past few days. Text messages throughout the day, a phone call Tuesday night that had lasted until nearly midnight, as they'd talked about everything and nothing, a casual lunch yesterday that had felt natural despite the curious glances from their colleagues. "Nervous?" Damien asked as they found parking near the medical complex. "Terrified," Amara said honestly. "You?" He reached across the console and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Same, but the good kind of terrified." Dr. Emily Rodriguez turned out to be exactly what Amara had hoped for, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile who radiated competent reassurance. Her office was decorated with photos of babies she'd delivered over the years, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and nurturing. "So," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling behind her desk after they'd completed the initial paperwork, "this is an exciting day, first prenatal visit." "Yes," Amara said, suddenly conscious of how Damien's presence beside her might be perceived. They'd discussed this, how to present their relationship without getting into complicated explanations. But now, sitting in the doctor's office, she felt exposed. "And you're the father?" Dr. Rodriguez asked Damien, with the casual directness that medical professionals perfected. "Yes," Damien replied, his voice steady and sure. "We both wanted to be here for this." If Dr. Rodriguez noticed anything unusual about their dynamic, the careful way they held themselves, the slight formality that suggested a relationship still finding its footing, she didn't comment. Instead, she smiled warmly and opened Amara's file. "Wonderful. Father's involvement from the beginning is so important for both mother and baby." She reviewed the notes from Amara's emergency room visit the previous week. "Based on your last menstrual period and the blood work from your ER visit, I'm calculating that you're about 11 weeks along. Does that sound right?" Amara nodded, hyper-aware of Damien beside her, of the way this clinical confirmation made everything more real somehow. "Any symptoms so far?" "Morning sickness, fatigue, breast tenderness." "Some nausea," Amara admitted, "especially in the mornings. And I've been more tired than usual. Completely normal. The good news is that most women find the nausea starts to improve around 12 to 14 weeks. Dr. Rodriguez made notes in the file. "Are you taking a prenatal vitamin?" "I started one after the ER visit," Amara said. "Perfect. Now, today we'll do a full physical exam, some additional blood work, and if you're interested, we can do an ultrasound. At 11 weeks, we should be able to see quite a bit, and hopefully hear the heartbeat." Amara felt Damien's hand find hers, squeezing gently. The idea of seeing their baby, hearing proof of the life they'd created, made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. "We'd like that," Damien said quietly. "The ultrasound. Wonderful. Let's get you changed into a gown, and we'll take a look." The examination was routine but thorough, Dr. Rodriguez explaining each step with the kind of patient professionalism that put Amara at ease. Damien waited in the hallway during the physical exam, but when the ultrasound technician arrived with her equipment, he was invited back in. "This might be a little cold," the technician warned, squeezing gel onto Amara's exposed abdomen. Amara reached for Damien's hand as the technician positioned the ultrasound wand, her heart hammering with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. The room felt charged with possibility, as if they were about to witness something miraculous. The monitor crackled to life, showing grainy black and white images that meant nothing to Amara's untrained eye. The technician moved the wand slowly, her expression focused and professional, as she searched for what she needed to find. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a small, bean-shaped shadow on the screen. "There's your baby." Amara's breath caught in her throat. It was tiny, impossibly, incredibly tiny, but there it was, real, alive, growing inside her. "Oh my God," Damien whispered beside her, his voice thick with emotion. That's your baby," the technician confirmed with a smile, "measuring right on track for 11 weeks. And now, let's see if we can find the heartbeat." She adjusted the equipment, and suddenly the room filled with a sound that Amara would remember for the rest of her life, a rapid, rhythmic whooshing that seemed impossibly strong for something so small. "There it is, Doctor," Rodriguez said, having returned for this moment. 168 beats per minute. Perfect." Amara turned to look at Damien and found tears streaming down his face. His gray eyes were bright with wonder and something that looked like overwhelming joy, and when he met her gaze, she saw her own amazement reflected there. "That's our baby's heartbeat," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "That's our baby," she whispered back, and suddenly the magnitude of what they were doing, what they'd created, hit her like a wave. They were going to be parents, together. This tiny, perfect thing on the monitor was half her and half him, a living symbol of the connection that had started as a single night and was growing into something neither of them had expected. The technician printed several copies of the ultrasound images, handing them the black and white photos that somehow contained an entire universe of possibility. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Rodriguez assured them as they prepared to leave. "I'd like to see you back in 4 weeks for your next appointment. In the meantime, continue with the prenatal vitamins, stay hydrated, and try to get plenty of rest." She handed them a packet of information and scheduled their next visit, but Amara barely processed the details. Her mind was still reeling from the image on the screen, from the sound of that impossibly fast heartbeat. They made it to the parking garage in relative silence, both of them processing what they'd just experienced. It wasn't until they reached Damien's car that the emotions finally overwhelmed them both. Did that really just happen? Amara asked, staring down at the ultrasound photo in her hands. I think so, Damien said, his own voice still rough. I think we just saw our child for the first time. He reached for her then, pulling her into his arms in the middle of the parking garage, holding her like she was something precious that might slip away. Amara melted into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished and utterly overwhelmed. I love you, he whispered into her hair, the words coming out like they'd been waiting months to be said. I know it's crazy, I know it's complicated, but Amara, I love you, both of you. The confession hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her heart she hadn't realized were dark. This wasn't the desperate passion of Chicago, or the tentative rebuilding of the past week. This was something deeper, more profound. Love that had grown from shared vulnerability and mutual understanding, and the miraculous reality of creating life together. I love you too, she said against his chest, the admission feeling like coming home. I've been trying not to, but I love you too. They stood there in the echoing concrete of the parking garage, holding each other and their unborn child, and Amara thought she might burst from the sheer intensity of everything she was feeling. What happens now, she asked when they finally pulled apart. Damien cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't remember starting to cry. Now we figure out how to do this, together, all of it, the pregnancy, the baby, us. We figure it out as we go. What about work? The promotion you mentioned, the company. We'll make it work, he said, with the quiet confidence that had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals from nothing. Whatever it takes, however complicated it gets, we'll make it work. The drive back to her apartment was different from the trip to the hospital, charged with new understanding and weighty with the reality of decisions that needed to be made. But beneath all of that was something warm and solid, the knowledge that they were in this together now, completely and without reservation. Stay for dinner? Amara asked as they pulled up outside her building. I could cook, or we could order something. I'd love to, Damien said, and the simple acceptance felt like another small miracle in a day full of them. Her apartment felt different with him in it again, not just as the man who'd brought her home from the hospital, but as the man who'd just heard their child's heartbeat, who'd told her he loved her in a parking garage and meant it with every fiber of his being. They ordered Thai food and ate it sitting on her couch, the ultrasound photos spread out on her coffee table like treasure maps to their future. Every few minutes, one of them would pick up a photo and stare at it in wonder, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. 10 fingers and 10 toes, Damien said, studying the grainy image with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. It's too early to see that, Amara laughed, curling up beside him on the couch. Dr. Rodriguez said we might be able to tell the sex in another month or two. Do you have a preference? He asked, wrapping his arm around her and pulling her closer. Healthy, she said immediately. That's all I care about. You? Same. Though, he paused, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I keep picturing a little girl with your eyes and your stubborn streak, or a little boy with your determination and your complete inability to delegate, she countered, laughing when he looked offended. I can delegate, he protested. You once spent 3 hours redoing a presentation that was already perfect because you didn't like the font choice. The font matters, he said seriously, then broke into a grin when she rolled her eyes. Okay, maybe I have control issues. Maybe, she teased, but the lightness of the moment was everything she hadn't known she needed. They talked late into the evening, about names and nurseries and the logistics of balancing careers with parenthood. They talked about their fears and their hopes, and the way hearing that heartbeat had changed something fundamental inside both of them. When Damien finally left, long after the Thai food containers had been cleared away, and the ultrasound photos had been carefully placed on her refrigerator, he kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her knees weak. I'll call you tomorrow, he promised, his forehead resting against hers. You'd better, she said, rising up on her toes to kiss him once more. That night, Amara fell asleep with one hand resting on her stomach and a smile on her face. In just a few hours, everything had changed again, but this time the change felt like grace, the sound of a heartbeat, the weight of love spoken aloud, the promise of a future neither of them had imagined, but both of them wanted with a fierceness that took their breath away. Some moments are so perfect, they reset your entire understanding of what's possible. Today was one of those moments. The strongest foundations are built to withstand storms, but sometimes the storm comes from within. 3 weeks after the ultrasound that changed everything, Amara stood in her new office on the 35th floor of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, staring out at the Manhattan skyline through her own floor-to-ceiling windows. Director of Strategic Development. The title looked impressive on her business cards and felt even better when she said it aloud. The promotion had gone through faster than anyone expected, helped along by Damien's influence, but justified by her own track record of excellence. Her new team respected her. The work was challenging and fulfilling, and for the first time in her career, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. So why did she feel like something was about to go terribly wrong? Knock, knock. Jessica's voice from the doorway interrupted her brooding. How's the new office treating you? Like a queen, Amara replied with a smile that felt only slightly forced. What brings you down from the executive floor? Jessica stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. Never a good sign. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Amara had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of someone carrying uncomfortable news. There's been some talk, Jessica said carefully, settling into one of the chairs across from Amara's desk. About your promotion, about the timing. Amara's stomach dropped, though she'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. What kind of talk? Nothing malicious, Jessica said quickly. At least not yet, but people are curious about how you went from assistant to director in less than 6 months. And then there's... She trailed off, but Amara knew what she wasn't saying, the way Damien looked at her now when he thought no one was watching. The carefully professional distance they maintained in public that somehow felt more intimate than touching. The way his voice changed when he said her name during meetings. People are talking about me and Mr. Hawthorne, Amara finished. Jessica nodded reluctantly. It's just speculation right now, but with your promotion coming so soon after that board meeting where you got sick, she shrugged helplessly. People are connecting dots. The irony was suffocating. They'd been so careful. Amara had moved departments. They maintained professional boundaries in public. They'd done everything possible to avoid exactly this situation. But love, it seemed, was harder to hide than either of them had anticipated. What are they saying exactly? Amara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. That maybe your promotion wasn't entirely based on merit. That maybe there were other factors involved. Jessica's expression was sympathetic but concerned. I don't believe it for a second. I've seen your work, I know how brilliant you are. But perception can be reality in corporate environments. After Jessica left, Amara tried to focus on the strategic planning report on her desk, but the words blurred together as her mind raced with implications. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, could be undermined by whispers and speculation. The respect of her colleagues, her professional reputation, her carefully constructed career, all of it suddenly felt fragile. Her phone buzzed with a text from Damien. Dinner tonight. I have something I want to discuss with you. She stared at the message, anxiety twisting in her stomach. His tone felt formal, almost distant. Was he having second thoughts? Had the rumors reached him too? She typed back, of course. My place at 7. Actually, could we meet at my apartment instead? I'll cook. The request was unusual. They'd been spending most of their time at her place, which felt safer, more neutral. His penthouse was intimidating in its perfection, a stark reminder of the differences in their lives that they'd been carefully ignoring. See you at 7. Damien's apartment was everything Amara remembered from the one time she'd been there for a work event. Sleek, modern, and utterly impersonal. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park, and the furnishings were expensive but cold. It felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. Hi, he said when he opened the door, but something was different in his greeting. The easy warmth they'd developed over the past few weeks was replaced by a careful politeness that made her chest tighten with anxiety. Hi, she replied, studying his face for clues about his mood. He looked tired, she realized, and there was a tension in his shoulders that reminded her of the early days when they'd been pretending nothing had happened between them. Dinner was perfectly prepared, salmon with asparagus and rice pilaf that tasted like it had been catered despite his claims of cooking. They made small talk about work and the weather and her doctor's appointment scheduled for the following week, but underneath the surface pleasantries, Amara could feel something building. You said you had something to discuss, she said finally, unable to bear the artificial distance any longer. Damien set down his fork, his expression growing serious. There have been some developments at work, things we need to address. If this is about the rumors, you've heard them. His sharp interruption confirmed her worst fears. Jessica mentioned that people are talking about my promotion, about us. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to show how much the speculation hurt. "I assume they've reached you as well." "The board is asking questions," he said quietly. "Nothing official yet, but Ronald Hartley pulled me aside today. He wanted to know if there was any truth to the speculation about our relationship." "What did you tell him?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions she could sense but not understand. "I told him that our personal and professional lives are completely separate, that your promotion was based solely on merit, and that any suggestion otherwise was both unfounded and inappropriate." It was the right answer, the professional answer, but something in his tone made her stomach clench with dread. "But," she prompted, "but he made it clear that any perception of impropriety could damage both of our careers, and more importantly, it could affect Sterling's reputation and our shareholders' confidence." The careful way he spoke, the return to corporate language, felt like a rejection even though his words were technically supportive. "Damien, what are you trying to say?" He stood abruptly, moving to the windows that overlooked Central Park. His reflection in the glass looked stark and isolated, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "I think we need to consider stepping back, publicly at least, until after the baby is born, until the situation stabilizes." The words hit her like physical blows. "Stepping back how? No more dinners, no more personal contact during work hours. We maintain complete professional distance until..." "Until when?" Amara's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "Until the rumors die down? Until people stop being curious about our lives? That could be months, Damien, years." "I know it's not ideal." "Not ideal." She stood as well, anger and hurt warring in her chest. "3 weeks ago you told me you loved me. You held me while we listened to our baby's heartbeat, and now you want to pretend none of that happened because some board members are asking uncomfortable questions. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple." The professional composure she'd maintained all day finally cracked completely. "You're choosing Sterling over us. Again, just like you did after Chicago, just like you'll do every time things get complicated." "That's not fair," Damien said, turning to face her. His grey eyes were stormy with emotions he was clearly struggling to control. "I'm trying to protect both of us. Your career, my company, our future." "Our future?" Amara laughed bitterly. "What future, Damien? The one where we sneak around like we're ashamed of each other? The one where our child grows up wondering why Daddy can't acknowledge that he loves Mommy? It's temporary. Nothing is temporary with you." The words exploded out of her, carrying months of suppressed frustration and fear. "You said you'd quit Sterling for me, but the moment there's actual pressure, you're asking me to hide. You say you love me, but only when it's convenient, only when it doesn't threaten your precious corporate empire." Damien's face went pale, but his jaw set in the stubborn line she recognized from boardroom battles. "You knew what you were getting into when we started this. You knew the complications. I knew we'd have challenges. I didn't know you'd run away the moment things got difficult." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was too angry to care. "I didn't know that the man who claimed he wanted to build a family with me would be willing to sacrifice our relationship the moment his board of directors started asking questions. I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm trying to find a way to make this work that doesn't destroy everything we've both built. By asking me to disappear. By asking me to pretend that the father of my child doesn't exist." She grabbed her purse from the counter, her hands shaking with rage and heartbreak. "Well, congratulations, Damien. You found your solution. I'll make it easy for you." "Amara, wait." "No," she said, heading for the door. "I've spent my whole life being disposable to people who were supposed to care about me. I won't do it with you, too." "That's not what this is." "Isn't it?" She turned at the door, meeting his eyes one last time. "Because it feels exactly like being abandoned. Again." The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless, each floor bringing a fresh wave of pain as the full implications of their conversation settled over her. She'd been a fool to think this could work, to believe that someone like Damien Hawthorne could choose love over power when push came to shove. By the time she reached her apartment, the anger had given way to devastating hurt. She'd opened herself up completely, trusted him with her heart, her body, their child, and at the first sign of real adversity, he'd chosen Sterling Pharmaceuticals over their family. Her phone rang almost immediately after she walked through her door. Damien's name on the screen made her chest ache, but she declined the call. It rang again 5 minutes later, then again 10 minutes after that. Finally, she turned it off. She was sitting on her couch, staring at the ultrasound photos still attached to her refrigerator, when the reality of her situation truly hit her. She was alone again, completely alone, carrying the child of a man who apparently loved his company more than he loved her. The irony was crushing. She'd spent years building walls to protect herself from exactly this kind of abandonment, and she'd torn them all down for Damien. She'd believed him when he said she could count on him, when he promised they were in this together. She'd been wrong. Outside her windows, Brooklyn settled into evening quiet, but inside her apartment the silence felt deafening. Tomorrow she'd have to face the office, the rumors, the careful speculation of colleagues who were probably right to question her relationship with their CEO. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out how to build a life as a single mother while working for the company owned by her child's father. Tonight, she just had to survive the crushing weight of her own broken heart. The ultrasound photos smiled back at her from the refrigerator, a tiny bean-shaped reminder that some loves create consequences that last far longer than the love itself. When the foundation cracks, everything built on top of it threatens to fall. But sometimes the strongest structures are forged in the aftermath of collapse. Sometimes the most powerful men in the world have to lose everything to discover what actually has value. Damien stood in his empty penthouse, staring at the spot where Amara had been standing just minutes ago, and felt his entire world collapse. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, not just the absence of her voice, but the complete vacuum left by her presence. The apartment, which had always felt like a sanctuary of success and achievement, now felt like a mausoleum to his own cowardice. I've spent my whole life being disposable to people who were supposed to care about me. I won't do it with you too. Her words echoed in his mind like an accusation, and with devastating clarity he realized what he'd just done. He'd taken the woman he loved, the woman carrying his child, the woman who'd trusted him with her heart despite every reason not to, and he'd made her feel disposable, just like everyone else in her life had done. His phone buzzed with a text from Ronald Hartley. "Appreciate your professionalism earlier. These situations can be delicate, but maintaining appropriate boundaries is essential for everyone involved." Damien stared at the message, and something inside him snapped. Appropriate boundaries. Professional distance. Corporate reputation. He'd spent 20 years building Sterling Pharmaceuticals, turning it into a billion-dollar empire that employed thousands of people and developed medications that saved lives. He was proud of what he'd accomplished, proud of the legacy he'd created from the ashes of his parents' death. But what good was any of that if he'd just destroyed the only thing that had ever made him truly happy? What good was being the most successful CEO in pharmaceutical history if he'd just abandoned the woman he loved when she needed him most? Damien grabbed his keys and headed for the door, but stopped when his phone rang. Sandra Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and something in his gut told him to answer. Sandra. "Damien, I'm calling because I just had a very interesting conversation with Ronald Hartley." Her voice was crisp and businesslike, but there was an undercurrent of something that sounded suspiciously like disapproval. "He seems to think he convinced you to end your relationship with Amara Collins." "Sandra, I can't discuss—" "The hell you can't." The steel in her voice cut through his corporate deflection like a blade. "That young woman is one of the most talented executives I've seen in 30 years of corporate law. She's also pregnant, in love, and from what I observed tonight, completely devastated. How did you—" "I saw her leaving the building 20 minutes ago, looking like her world had ended. It doesn't take a genius to connect the dots." Sandra's voice softened slightly. "Damien, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. What exactly do you think you're protecting by pushing her away?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The company, her career, both of our reputations. Bullshit. The profanity from the normally elegant Sandra was so unexpected that it stopped him cold. "You're protecting yourself. You're so terrified of losing control, of appearing vulnerable, that you're willing to sacrifice the best thing that's ever happened to you. That's not— Let me tell you something about corporate reputation, Mr. CEO. Sandra's voice carried the authority of someone who'd managed countless high-stakes situations. Companies weather scandals all the time. Board members who clutch their pearls about executive relationships usually forget about them when the quarterly numbers look good. But you know what they don't forget? You know what actually damages a company's reputation?" Damien waited, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "Leaders who abandon their principles when things get difficult. Leaders who choose fear over integrity. Leaders who prove they can't be trusted to honor their commitments when the stakes get high." The words landed like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the justifications he'd been constructing in his mind. You want to know what the board really cares about? Sandra continued. They care about having a CEO who can handle pressure, who can make difficult decisions, who has the strength to stand by what matters, even when it's uncomfortable. And, if the shareholders will respect honesty far more than cowardice. Damien, you've built Sterling into an empire by taking calculated risks and standing behind your decisions. Why are you suddenly afraid to apply those same principles to your personal life? After Sandra hung up, Damien stood in his apartment for another 10 minutes, staring at his reflection in the dark windows. The man looking back at him was successful, powerful, respected, and completely alone. He thought about his parents, about the love they'd shared that had shaped his understanding of what was possible between two people. They'd faced challenges together, financial struggles, career setbacks, the normal pressures of building a life, but they'd never faced them apart. They'd never chosen safety over love. His father had once told him that the most important decision a man ever made wasn't about his career or his money or his reputation. It was about who he chose to stand beside when the world got difficult. Damien had just failed that test spectacularly, but it wasn't too late to retake it. The emergency board meeting Damien called for 8 o'clock the next morning raised eyebrows throughout Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Emergency meetings were usually reserved for crises, hostile takeovers, FDA investigations, catastrophic product failures. Not for the CEO to make personal announcements. The boardroom filled slowly, members arriving with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Ronald Hartley looked particularly smug, probably assuming that Damien was going to announce some new policy about workplace relationships or executive conduct. He was about to be very disappointed. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Damien began, standing at the head of the polished conference table, where he'd made countless decisions over the years. "I've called this meeting to address some recent concerns about my personal life and how it might affect Sterling Pharmaceuticals." Murmurs rippled around the table, but Damien held up a hand for silence. "There have been rumors and speculation about my relationship with Amara Collins, who was recently promoted to Director of Strategic Development. Rather than let those rumors continue to circulate, I'm here to confirm them." Ronald Hartley's face went pale. "Damien, perhaps this isn't the appropriate forum." "This is exactly the appropriate forum," Damien said firmly, "because I want there to be absolutely no confusion about where I stand. Yes, I'm in love with Amara Collins. Yes, she is pregnant with my child. And yes, I intend to marry her if she'll have me." The silence that followed was deafening, but Damien wasn't finished. "I understand that some of you may have concerns about how this affects the company. Let me address those directly. Ms. Collins' promotion was based solely on her exceptional qualifications and track record of success. Her department now reports to David Chen, not to me, eliminating any direct conflict of interest. Her performance reviews will be conducted by her immediate supervisor and HR, not by me." He paused, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. "More importantly, I want to be clear about my priorities. Sterling Pharmaceuticals will always have my professional dedication and expertise, but my personal life, my family, and my happiness are not negotiable. I've spent 20 years building this company, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together, but I'm not willing to sacrifice the woman I love for the comfort of anyone in this room." Ronald Hartley found his voice first. "Damien, the optics of this situation—" "The optics," Damien interrupted, "are that Sterling Pharmaceuticals has a CEO who honors his commitments and stands by his principles. If that's problematic for any of you, I'm happy to discuss succession planning." The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Damien had built Sterling from nothing, turned it into one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in the world. His departure would be devastating, not just to the company's operations, but to its stock price and market confidence. Sandra Morrison spoke into the silence, her voice calm and measured. "I think what Damien is demonstrating is exactly the kind of leadership we want in our CEO. The ability to handle complex situations with integrity and transparency, the strength to make difficult decisions and stand by them." Several other board members nodded, and Damien could see the tide turning in his favor. These were business people, after all. They understood calculated risks and long-term strategy. "Are there any other concerns?" Damien asked. When none were raised, he moved toward the door. "Then, if you'll excuse me, I have a very important apology to make." Amara's new office felt like a prison, as she tried to focus on the strategic planning documents spread across her desk. She'd barely slept the night before, alternating between rage and heartbreak until she'd finally given up on rest entirely. She'd arrived early to avoid the curious glances of colleagues who might have heard rumors about her abrupt departure from Damien's apartment building the previous evening. The last thing she needed was more speculation about her personal life. Her assistant knocked and entered with her morning coffee. Decaf now, another reminder of how much her life had changed. "Ms. Collins, I hate to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. If it's Mr. Hawthorne, tell him I'm in meetings all day," Amara said without looking up from her papers. "Actually, it's Sandra Morrison from legal." Amara's head snapped up. Sandra's appearance at her office could only mean one thing: damage control. The older woman probably wanted to discuss how to manage the situation, how to minimize the impact on both their careers. "Send her in," Amara said, straightening her shoulders for what was sure to be an uncomfortable conversation. Sandra entered and closed the door behind her, but instead of taking a seat, she moved to the window and peered down at the street below. "Interesting view from here," Sandra said conversationally. "You can see the main entrance, the parking garage, even part of the plaza across the street." "Sandra, if you're here to discuss last night—" "I'm here," Sandra interrupted, "to ask if you own a television." The non sequitur caught Amara off guard. "I'm sorry? A television or a computer with internet access? Because if you do, you might want to turn on the financial news in about 10 minutes. Before Amara could ask what she meant, Sandra was gone, leaving behind only confusion and the faint scent of expensive perfume. Exactly 10 minutes later, Amara's computer chimed with a news alert from the Financial Times. "Sterling Pharmaceuticals CEO makes surprise personal announcement to board." Her heart stopped. The article was brief but devastating. CEO Damien Hawthorne confirmed to the company's board of directors this morning that he is in a relationship with recently promoted Director of Strategic Development Amara Collins, who is expecting his child. In an unprecedented move, Hawthorne stated that his personal life and family commitments are not negotiable, and indicated he would be willing to step down rather than end the relationship. Amara stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again until they blurred together. He'd done it. He'd actually stood up to the board, made their relationship public, put everything on the line. For her, for them, for their child. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial his number, commotion outside her office caught her attention. Through the glass walls, she could see people gathering near the elevators, pointing and talking in excited whispers. Sandra's words came back to her. "You can see the main entrance from here." Amara moved to her window and looked down at the street below. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Damien stood in the plaza across from Sterling Pharmaceuticals, surrounded by news cameras and reporters who must have caught wind of his board announcement. But he wasn't looking at the cameras or answering questions. He was looking up at her building, scanning the windows as if he was searching for something specific, searching for her. Even from 35 floors up, she could see the determination in his posture, the way he stood like a man who'd finally figured out what truly mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text, and Damien's name on the screen made her heart race. "I know you can see me. Please come down. I have something to say, and I want the whole world to hear it." Amara stared at the message, then back down at the man standing in the middle of Manhattan's financial district, waiting for her with the patience of someone who would stay there all day if necessary. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like descending through layers of fear and hope and possibility. By the time she reached the main floor, her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could barely breathe. The moment she stepped outside, the chaos of news crews and curious onlookers faded into background noise. All she could see was Damien, standing in the middle of it all like an island of certainty in a storm of confusion. He moved toward her slowly, and she could see something in his face that she'd never seen before. Not the controlled confidence of the CEO, not even the vulnerable passion of the man who'd held her through the night in Chicago. This was something new. Something that looked like a man who'd finally figured out how to fight for what he loved. "Amara," he said when he reached her, his voice carrying over the crowd noise, "I need to say something to you. And since I've apparently spent the morning making my private life public anyway, I figured I might as well do it properly." The crowd pressed closer, cameras turning their way, but Amara barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the man standing in front of her with his heart in his eyes. "I was wrong," Damien said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was terrified and stupid, and I made the biggest mistake of my life when I asked you to hide what we have together." Tears started flowing down her cheeks, but she couldn't speak. "I love you," he continued, his voice strong and sure. I love your strength and your brilliance, and the way you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be. I love that you're carrying our child, and I love that you trusted me enough to let me be part of this miracle we created together." He dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the plaza, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The crowd gasped, cameras flashed, and Amara's entire world tilted on its axis. "I spent 20 years building a company," Damien said, looking up at her with absolute certainty. "But you taught me how to build a life. Amara Collins, will you marry me? Will you help me figure out how to be the man our child deserves to have as a father? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you'll never be disposable to me?" The question hung between them like a bridge, not just to marriage, but to everything they'd both been too scared to reach for. Amara looked down at the man she loved, kneeling in front of half of Manhattan's financial district, offering her everything he had to give. The same man who'd chosen Sterling over her just 12 hours ago was now choosing her over everything else in his world. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes!" The crowd erupted in cheers as Damien slipped the ring onto her finger and swept her into his arms. The kiss they shared was desperate and joyful and absolutely perfect, a promise sealed in front of witnesses who would ensure that the whole world knew Damien Hawthorne had chosen love over everything else. When they finally broke apart, Amara looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, messy and complicated, and absolutely worth fighting for. "I love you too," she said against his lips, "even when you're an idiot." His laugh was pure joy. "Especially when I'm an idiot, I hope, because I'll probably be one again." "Probably," she agreed, "but we'll figure it out together." As camera flashes captured the moment for posterity and the sounds of celebration filled the Manhattan air, two people who'd almost lost everything discovered that some loves are strong enough to withstand any storm, including the ones we create ourselves. Sometimes the grandest gestures happen in the middle of ordinary Tuesday mornings. Sometimes the most powerful men in the world have to fall to their knees to find their strength. And sometimes love requires a leap of faith in full view of everyone watching. Final message. Amara and Damien's journey reminds us that true love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when fear tries to pull us apart. Sometimes the greatest risk is opening your heart, and sometimes the most powerful gesture is admitting when you're wrong and fighting for what truly matters. Their story shows us that love doesn't always follow the rules, but when it's real, it's worth breaking every rule to protect it. From a single night in Chicago to a public proposal in Manhattan, they proved that some connections are too powerful to deny, and some loves are worth every risk. What would you have done in Amara's place? Would you have said yes to Damien's public proposal after everything they'd been through? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.